So the question arises, who wrote it? My nephew, John Hines, always made a joke of it. His eldest son was about to be born. We asked him, what are you going to name the boy? And he said, well, he was thinking of a Bible name. I said, oh, really? What's that? He says, yes, the Hebrew writer. Because so many preachers just can't make up their mind who wrote Hebrews. And so they don't want to go out on any limbs anywhere. So whenever they refer to the book of Hebrews, they'll say, the Hebrew writer told us. And leave it, everybody going, yeah. So he was going to name his kid the Hebrew writer. He didn't, but he threatened to. Some people say that it was written by Clement of Rome, which, if we have time tonight, I'll show you some of the why. Some say it was Barnabas, who was a companion of Paul. Some say Silas or Silvanus, and some Apollos, and some Aquila, some Mark, but most say that it is reference, it is Paul. And we're going to think about that a little bit. See what we can do. I should be in a rush. Alan is racing through 1 Corinthians, stifling all question and conversation about it. I don't hurry that much, so I'm sorry. I've got a little time left, and we're going to study about it. One of the things that if it wasn't Paul, any idea of somebody else is absolutely a matter of conjecture. There's no proof at all about anybody other than Paul. It's just guesswork beyond that. And so I think I can show you that Paul's the reasonable one. First of all, the Christian fathers, these are preachers, I'll call them gospel preachers, men who lived in the centuries following the apostles. Many of them knew the apostles. They, as they write about it, they describe it to Paul. Many of them do. First is a man by the name of Patanus, probably mispronouncing that, who was and several of these men were Oriental scholars. He was from the catechetical school in Alexandria, which was one of the principal schools, theology schools in this period of time. He lived about 180 AD, and his actual writings don't exist anymore, but he is quoted and spoken of by others at length. He's quoted by Eusebius, he's quoted by Jerome. They brag on him a great deal. He's quoted by Clement of Alexandria, whom we're going to mention in a minute, who quotes him and says, he says, now as the blessed presbyter Patanus used to say, since the Lord, who was the apostle of the Almighty, was sent to the Hebrews, Paul, by reason of his inferiority, as if sent to the Gentiles, did not subscribe himself an apostle to the Hebrews, out of reverence to the Lord, and because he wrote of his abundance to the Hebrews, as a herald and apostle to the Gentiles. Now, I don't care what he says so much as the fact that here he was ascribing the book to Paul. And if you've got a fellow who flourished and became head of this school in 180, you can go back pretty easily 50, 60, 70 years, and that's getting you back pretty well to the start of what would have been the 2nd century. He had Photius, as he writes about him in Eusebius' Ecclesiastical History, says he had learned from those who had seen the apostles. So we're talking about sort of the second, third generation. He was sent as a missionary as far as India by the Bishop of Alexandria. So a pretty reputable example. Clement of Alexandria, who, by the way, followed this man in Alexandria, also writing of this says, again, Eusebius quoting him, he says that the book was addressed to the Hebrews, written in their language, and afterward translated by Luke for the Greeks. Now that may well be an important point. He argues that it was translated by Luke into Greek, which is why one of the objections people have to the book of Hebrews being written by Paul is the style is off. If you read these things enough in Greek and so forth, the style is off. And the reason for that may be that Paul wrote in Hebrew, Aramaic, probably, to the Hebrews, and then the book was translated into Greek by Luke. At least that's what Clement of Alexandria said. And he also says that Paul probably did not sign the book because he perceived a prejudice on the part of the Jews against him, which also may well be true. And he several times talks about Paul and the authorship of the epistle. Origen, who was born about 185 AD, he was also important in the school in Alexandria, about 213. He followed these other two men. And Jerome and others refer to him as the greatest doctor of the church since the apostles. He was a very influential man. Traveled a great deal. He writes, possibly someone pressed with this argument will have recourse to the opinion of those who reject this epistle as not written to Paul by Paul. And so his opinion was that it was written by Paul. You can go on further to, for instance, the Council of Antioch, which took place in 264. Eusebius is writing about it about 264, 320 in that area. He thought Paul wrote it as he comments about it. After Eusebius, Hebrews was there. You understand there was a division in thought between the East and the West. And in the East, Syrians and in Asia Minor and in Palestine and so forth, and of course in Africa, in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, Hebrews was pretty universally received. In the West, they were a lot slower to receive it, but there were some in the West. Tertullian, for instance, ascribes it to Barnabas. He says Barnabas wrote it. On what basis? I have no idea. But finally, about 392, in the time of Jerome, East and West came together, and the book was universally regarded as written by Paul. In the East, the historical basis of the book, Hebrews were primarily in the East. It should be obvious that Paul wrote it because they knew it better, they knew the book better, and ascribed it to Paul. Even those in the West eventually agreed. And so you can also look at the internal evidence of the book. I mentioned the style. They object on the basis of style, but there's two or three things that can be said about style in writing. The time or the place or the circumstances of writing anybody have a great effect on the style. For instance, the Gospel of John and John's epistles are vastly different from the book of Revelation, but John wrote them all. If you look in the Old Testament, there's a tremendous difference between Leviticus and Deuteronomy in terms of style, but Moses wrote both of them. And so style alone is not the decision. It seems reasonable that the style of Hebrews written to Paul's brethren, specifically to the Hebrews, would have been different, maybe more emotional, tender, sublime. And as I mentioned earlier, the book may have been translated by Luke, and thus the style perhaps appearing a little bit odd because of the translation. It was a different sort of book. You know, sometimes you sit down to write a letter to a friend and you write in a certain style. But then every now and then you sit down to write more formally, and you have a different style of writing. And so you have not only the time and the place affecting the book, but you also have the character of the writing. This book, in its approach and subject matter, is vastly different than the other 13 epistles of Paul. So if Paul withheld his name, right, whoever the writer was, he withheld his name, it seems reasonable to assume if he was concerned about the Jewish brethren enough to withhold his name, it seems reasonable to assume that that would affect his writing as well. And you need to consider that the Holy Spirit may have decided to, as Paul wrote this book, may have decided to change to some extent the approach and the character of the writing, adapting it to the audience, and adapting it to what Paul had to say. I don't think you can rule that out at all. Look with me in the text at a couple of things, and we'll think about them. Some of the arguments that are made against Paul as the author. In Hebrews 2, the text says, therefore we, and I'm laying stress on the pronoun, we ought to give the more earnest heed to the things which we've heard, lest at any time we should let them slip. And then again in verse 3, how shall we escape if we neglect so great salvation, which at the first began to be spoken to the Lord, and was confirmed unto us by them that heard him? And the argument is that Paul is leaving himself out as one who heard the Lord and grouping himself in with his Hebrew listeners. So that's one of the arguments that Paul could not have been the author here. But what you need to realize is this is a fairly common figure of speech. Look a little bit further with me into the 6th chapter and in verse 1. Therefore, leaving the principles of the doctrine of Christ, let us go on unto perfection, not laying again the foundation of repentance from dead works and of faith toward God. And then he goes on to say the doctrine of baptism, laying on of hands, and the resurrection of the dead, and of eternal judgment, do if God permit. And again, there it's a literary technique of including yourself with the people you're writing to. So it's not necessarily that he is saying that he was not one of those who heard the Lord, but he's saying that he is, in a literary fashion, identifying himself with the Hebrews to whom he's writing. And it's fairly, I think it's fairly common done to use the first person plural instead of the second for to make a good impression. You see, you can see some other examples of the thing. No, that's some say that it sort of sounds like this Alexandrian school, which may well be true. Paul may well have been educated in Alexandria to some extent by those who were there. But anyway, some of the proofs, I think, that the book was written by Paul is, first of all, the fact that it's anonymous. Why would anybody else besides Paul not have attached his name to it? You know, if it was Barnabas, if it was Silas, if it was Silvanus, if it was Apollos, why wouldn't they put their name in? There's no good reason for them not to have. And so to work that, the other writings of Paul. In chapter 13, in verse 23, you begin to see some things that strongly suggest that it might have been Paul. Chapter 13, 23 says, "Know ye that our brother Timothy is set at liberty, with whom, if he comes shortly, I will see you." Now, whoever this writer was, he was close with Timothy, and indicates that Timothy's going to come with him. The set at liberty may be referring to the fact that Timothy had been imprisoned, but the wording, the wording that you see there is not necessarily the idea of being freed from prison. It might be, like your kids got out of school. I'm free. I'm not obligated to the job that I was doing anymore. So it can be a little bit ambiguous in those regards. In verse 24, he says, "Salute all them that have the rule over you, and all the saints. They of Italy salute you." That reference to Italy, where Paul would have been imprisoned for quite a bit of time, does seem to again point to Paul writing from Rome, having a pretty good communication with the rest of the world. Anyway, any other comments about who wrote it? I'm going to go on to something that might be a little more extensive that I find interesting. When was it written? Yeah, that's fairly obvious. Yeah. Yes, I want to show you some other things in a minute, but when was it written? It was obviously written before 70 AD. chapter 9 of Hebrews, in verse 8, it says, he says here in this place, the Holy Ghost, this signifying that the way into the holiest of all was not yet made perfect, not yet made manifest, while as the first tabernacle was yet standing. So that seems to point fairly clearly the first tabernacle standing. In Hebrews 13, in verse 10, you have the indication that there were people still serving at the temple. 13:10 says, we have an altar whereof they have no right to eat, which serve the tabernacle. So anyway, it does seem to indicate that there were people still serving the tabernacle. Oh, Hebrews 8 and verse 13, which might be saying the same sort of thing. I sort of doubt it, but anyway. He says, in that he saith, a new covenant he hath made the first old, and then adds, now that which decayeth and waxeth old is ready to vanish away. And that seems to indicate that the temple had not been destroyed and so forth. Anyway, chronologically, if it's written by Paul, Paul died about 68. So right there, right before 67, 68, in that area would be sort of the time when it might be written. You have some other, I don't know how much of this I want to go through with you, but we'll try. I want somebody to read for me, and then I'm going to read from another book for you. And we will start with glory. Okay? So I want you to read from Hebrews and chapter 1. Read through verse 7. Chapter 1, verse 1 through verse 7. We can read further, but that'll do. Then read verse 13 too. Okay, I spoke to you earlier about Clement of Alexandria. There's another Clement. There's Clement of Rome. And he was writing in 96 AD. So right about the same time that John was writing the book of Revelation. Clement of Rome was, of course, not inspired. But he was writing a fairly large letter from the church in Rome to the church in Corinth. And here's what he says. This is Clement, who being the brightness of his majesty is by so much greater than the angels, as he hath by inheritance obtained a more excellent name than they. For it is written, who maketh his angels spirits and his ministers a flame of fire. But of his son, thus saith the Lord, thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee. Ask of me, and I will give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession. And again he saith unto them, sit on my right hand, until I make thy enemies thy footstool. It's in chapter 36, maybe verse 36 of this particular letter. Doesn't it sound sort of familiar? This is written in 96 AD, so it's very obvious that he was referencing the book of Hebrews. And this would have been just about 30 years, a little less, maybe a little more, after we're suggesting Paul wrote this book. Let's notice another one. This is in chapter 3. And Bill, would you read verses 2 through 5? These are quotations from Clement. He says, when also Moses that blessed and faithful servant in all his house. He also says in another place, Moses was called faithful in all his house. There's no place else he could have gotten that except in the book of Hebrews. So the book was existing. Jan, do you want to read? Look at chapter 4 and verse 12. Clement says, he is a searcher of the intents and thoughts. Ronnie, chapter 6 and verse 18. Clement says, nothing is impossible with God but to lie. So, God can't lie. Again, he's a paraphrase of this passage. Now, I could go on and on with it. I'm not going to go. I could go on for quite a way with this. As Clement does, he's obviously in his long letter to the Corinthians, obviously having reference to the book of Hebrews. And this is still in the first century, which does indicate that the book was written in the first century. So it's obvious the book had been in existence for some time previous to this, to the end of the century. Maybe obviously been written before John wrote the book of Revelation. Clement was writing about, as I say, about the same time. In addition, Clement obviously was receiving this epistle as belonging to the Bible, belonging to the canon, and accepting it as the Word of God, for he quotes from it, just as he quotes from other books that we regard as canonical. He doesn't always quote verbatim, but I must admit that I'm a little bit like the apostles. I've been known, in this age, I kind of laugh at some of my preaching brethren because they are so determined to footnote everything. And I'm not a real big footnoter. But then neither was Paul, neither was Clement here, neither were any of these people. You're going to have to pick up, you ain't going to have to know where they're quoting from and so forth in order to know what they're saying. And in the writers in the New Testament, many times are quoting from the Old Testament, but they don't always cite it. They don't always say, hey, this is from Jeremiah, the 4th chapter, and verse 13. Just quote the verse. And that was perfectly acceptable. There wasn't a big footnote. They didn't have, who was that English teacher we had here? Fresh connection. What? Mrs. Mills, yes. She she was a Lutheran preacher's wife, and she sort of let me have it there in my first year in college. She calmed down a little bit. I remember getting many papers back with a lot of red on them, and she corrected my style. But she was a good teacher. Got a little drunk on the weekends. Came in hungover most of the time, but she was a really good teacher, and you didn't cross her on Monday morning. Clement makes the statement, as is written, he says, who makes his angels spirits and his ministers a flame of fire. It's all there. So Clement was an elder, we'll call him, an overseer of the church at Rome. He was a bishop there. It's almost impossible to imagine that they would have accepted a book or a letter, the letter of Hebrews, if they didn't regard it as inspired. He wouldn't have been quoting from it if he didn't regard it as inspired. So you do have the warnings of John in some of his epistles. John 4, believe not every spirit, but try the spirits, whether they are of God, because many false prophets are gone into the world. But here he is quoting, obviously, from this book of Hebrews. Obviously, by the end of the first century, the book is being widely accepted. The book is in some of the oldest versions of the New Testament. The Peshitta Syriac, the book is there, it exists there, and it's a translation of the Bible, and it is dated to about 150 AD. The Syriac contains all the books of the New Testament except a few. 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, Jude, and Revelation are not there. And it doesn't contain any extra books, but it does contain the book of Hebrews. So in Syria, it's obvious this book was being accepted. The Latin versions, all dated about the same time as this, all accept the book as inspired. It's also in various catalogs of the New Testament books. Origen catalogs at about 220, Eusebius 315, Athanasius 326. All of them catalog this book as belonging in the Bible. It contains evidence of its own authenticity, in that it doesn't contradict anything else in the Bible or in the New Testament. It doesn't, there's no discrepancy. It is written, and this is an important thing, if you read some of the apocryphal books, one of the first things you'll notice is, we called it style a minute ago. We're talking about the style of this book. But as you read these other books, they simply do not have the dignity, the majesty, the authority of the books that we have in our New Testament. And this book speaks of the same sort of thing. They're more flippant. They're more the subject of rumor and myth and legend instead of this, so that the book, as you read it, feels like he is dealing with that which is quick and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword, as he says. It has a depth of meaning that, one fellow writing about this that I was studying says that, you can read Plato and Aristotle and Locke and Newton and others, and they're profound books, but as you can study them and you get to the bottom of it, you understand what they were saying. But this book, and in all the books of the New Testament, they have the same depth of meaning, but you won't ever get to the bottom. We will never be able to say, I finally understand everything about the book of Hebrews, the book of Luke, the book of Acts. There'll always be something that I missed, something that I never saw, some new vista. You know, I think of, I occasionally go sailing. And one of the things that's so surprising sailing is you're looking for a port. You're looking for an inlet. And I can see it. I've got a computerized map. I don't go anywhere without a computer. But I got this computerized map in front of me, and it says, hey, that inlet is right over there. I stare over there. I can't see it. The map says it's over there, but I can't see it. And Gloria's traveled with me a couple times at night, and I'll go past it because I can't believe my own eyes. And she'll say, no, it's back there, don't you know? And we'll go back. The Bible is that sort of thing until it opens up, till you open up that inlet and can see in. It may be sheltered by an island or a turn in the bay so that you can't really see it's there. The same thing's true of the scriptures. They have a depth and a fullness of meaning that is inexhaustible. You won't get to it right away. And so, to sum up, maybe 4 or 5 points we've looked at, it was probably written by Paul. I'm going to give it to Paul. I don't know who else could have written it. It was quoted by those who were pretty close to contemporaries of the New Testament, who indicate to us that it was clearly written by an inspired man. It's found in all the ancient versions of the New Testament. It's contained in most of the catalogs of the canonical books of the New Testament written during those early centuries. And it has in itself a depth of meaning which really sort of distinguishes the Bible from all other books. So yes, I think we can study the book of Hebrews. I have no problem at all saying Paul wrote Hebrews. It's the 14th book, and with confidence. We'll look a little bit more next week at sort of a rough outline of what Paul's trying to say, but the purpose of the book, what he was trying to say to them. But the book is beautiful. It is absolutely beautiful as he describes the superiority of, and you know, I've got so many other things I want to say. There's a lot of people who've begun to dismiss major portions of the New Testament as somehow only having reference to a specific group at a specific time. I wrote a thing back years ago that got picked up by some people. I called it Galatians for Galatia. Some people arguing that the book of Galatians only really applied to the Galatians and you couldn't take it out of its context. There's a lot of folks that say that about 2 John. And somehow or other, we have no right to say that those who bring false doctrine into the Lord's church today, we should have nothing to do with, which is the implication of 2 John. But that 2 John was limited to some specific Gnostic heresy. But a lot of people seem to take that attitude about the book of Hebrews, but Hebrews not only had a beautiful meaning to these Jews, to see the superiority, the vast superiority of what the Lord had brought to pass in the gospel. But also for us, we can see it as we compare the progress of the Old Testament giving way to the New. And we see this plan of God in those regards. I'll watch. I think the kids are coming up now. And we'll wait for them to arrive. do you got, Max? Let me see your paper. What were you studying about?